African American, the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. And you should have sort of these little half pages. Kay is holding one up. The exhibit is called Beyond Boundaries, the sculpture of Alice Wesley Ivory, and the exhibit will be held in the Contemporary Gallery at the Jefferson School from September 14th to December 14th. As the flyer tells you on the seat, this is going to celebrate the legacy of an African American woman named Alice Wesley Ivory, widely known and deeply appreciated for her sculptures in metal of animals and insects and little things, little special things. Two of these works are in the possession of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and will be loaned to us for this very special exhibit. She was a first African American hired at the Blue Ridge School, where she led the art department, and before she taught at the segregated Burley School for close to a decade. We're going to have an opening reception on September 14th, and I hope all of you will come. It will be a very special moment. And then on November 11th, for Veterans Day, we're going to have a program here at the center, which is going to be the Dogwood Vietnam Memorial Panel Discussion. We're going to be talking about, people on the panel, how a community heals from war, especially one as divisive as the Vietnam War. This is the 50th anniversary coming up of the fall of Saigon that ended the Vietnam War. And so we will be learning about the Charlottesville-based group that upkeeps the country's first Vietnam memorial and their plans for making this space more into a space of community healing. I think it'll be a really interesting program. We will be sending out things to members so you can register for these events, so please be on the lookout for that. Now, beyond announcements, I would like to tell you about tonight. So tonight, we are bringing you another edition of our speaker series, and our special guest tonight, who's going to be speaking on telling some Jewish stories at Monticello. Our speaker tonight is Olivia Brown. Olivia has been a long-time lover of history from the time she was a young girl, and her academic focus has always been on Jewish American history, a passion she pulls from her own family history. Olivia has a bachelor's degree in history and American studies from the University of Virginia, a graduate certificate in museum management, and a master's degree in public history from the University of South Carolina. She earned that degree in 2018, and her thesis focused on the intersection of Jewish and Southern foodways. Maybe one day we'll ask her to come and talk about that. She's worked previously as a tour guide at both James Monroe's Highland and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and as a community programs manager for the Mercer Museum and Fonthill Castle in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. She's also produced podcasts for the Thomas Jefferson Foundation in partnership with WTJU, something her generation does, but mine does not. Currently, she is working in sales operation for Stanley Martin Homes and runs a private events company called, wait for this, Trivia with Olivia. And it's a very popular program, and I think she's going to do one at some point for the Historical Society too. So we hope you'll all come back for Trivia with Olivia. Her talk tonight, she's also an ACHS board member, and we're very, very pleased to have her on our board. So her talk tonight was developed when she was a History Interpretation Fellow, won a fellowship through the International Center for Jefferson Studies in 2023. She developed this talk. So I'm very, very happy to present to you Olivia Brown, who will speak tonight on telling some Jewish stories at Monticello. Please welcome.
So welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us here. Thank you, Phyllis, Tom, and everyone with the Historical Society for having me. Luckily, I was a tour guide for quite some time, and I was never told that anyone couldn't hear me, so hopefully that won't be an issue for you tonight. As Phyllis mentioned, I served as a Historic Interpretation Research Fellow at the Jefferson Library, also known as the International Center for Jefferson Studies. And I spent 1 month last November researching more about the Jewish ties to Monticello, especially looking at how Jewish stories were tied to stories of enslavement at the plantation too. So today I'm going to be sharing some of what I learned. I put some in parentheses because I can't possibly tell you all the stories, nor did I get a chance to learn all the stories while I was conducting this research. So I'm excited to share these stories with you tonight. As I did used to spend my days as a tour guide at Monticello, I figured we could start like any good tour might, and that is with just some brief background. Often when people think of Jewish history at Monticello, either they think of nothing at all, or perhaps they think of the Levy family. Now, there is a very rich Jewish history in our country as well, dating back hundreds of years. The first Jewish person to arrive in what is now the United States was likely Joachim Gans in 1585. He was a miner from Prague who was hired as part of the expedition of Sir Walter Raleigh. The first place to have an actual Jewish community, however, was New Amsterdam, which we would now call New York. And that was in 1654. Now, for about 30 years, the Jews of New Amsterdam were barred from even having a communal religious space of their own. They faced restrictive laws on where they could live, how far out of the city they could travel or trade. Now, as you can see a little bit just on this brief timeline here, there were other Jewish communities in this early period of European colonization in North America. In British North America, Jews created spaces for themselves in Newport, Rhode Island in 1658, Savannah, Georgia in 1733, and then Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Charleston, South Carolina in the 1740s as well. However, the earliest Jews to arrive in Albemarle County are believed to be Michael and Sarah Israel, for whom Israel's Mountain and Israel's Gap are named. They purchased land around the North Garden area, but were not living in what we might consider Charlottesville today. When we think about Charlottesville itself, we should also think more about the early 19th century in the lifetime of Thomas Jefferson. I'll talk more in depth about some of the people whose names you see listed up here. But in Charlottesville, some of the earliest recorded Jewish people were merchants, like David Isaacs and Isaac Raphael, a lawyer named Nathaniel Wolfe, and others like D.H. Stern and A.B. Heller. Now, while there were clearly Jewish people living in the city during Thomas Jefferson's lifetime, they did not have a house of worship. The local synagogue, Congregation Beth Israel, was not founded until 1881. So for the people that you see whose names are here, if they wanted to have a formal place to practice their Jewish faith, they would have had to travel to Richmond to do so. Richmond's synagogue, called Kahal Kadosh Beth Shalom. Now, in 1700, there were only approximately 200 Jews living in British North America, compared to a total population of just over 250,000, making it only about 0.08% of the population, aka very, very small. That number grew, and by the time of the American Revolution, there were approximately 2,500 Jews living in that same region. Around 1769, a German Jewish immigrant named Isaiah Isaacs became the first Jewish person to settle in Richmond, Virginia. He and his business partner, Jacob I. Cohen, eventually helped found the first synagogue there I mentioned, Kahal Kadosh Beth Shalom. And in 1789, they helped to found that temple. Eventually, Isaiah Isaacs' brother, David Isaacs, who was also born in Germany, came to Virginia as well, though we don't know the exact year on that. And we'll talk a lot about David Isaacs during the course of my presentation today. Now, there was also a strong Jewish presence in the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War. To give an idea for anyone who's familiar with the Levy family of Monticello, members of Uriah Levy's family were a part of the Continental Army. His grandfather, Jonas Phillips, his father, Michael Levy, and his uncle, Manuel Noah, were all Revolutionary War veterans. Now, to round out my little bit of background for you, I'll just mention the other statistic that you see up here. By 1790, there were approximately 200 Jews living in the state of Virginia, with Richmond serving as that largest community. And this kind of brought me, this was of course a research project that I was doing, and it brought me to kind of the question I was asking myself while looking at the history of Monticello. So as I considered the Jewish history tied to Monticello, perhaps could ask ourselves this: how did a Jewish man from New York come to enslave people in Charlottesville, but a Jewish man from Virginia instead married into the free black community? That is the question that I posed to myself, spent about 30 days working on it. Got some answers, didn't get other answers, but it's okay, research always continues. Now, my intent was that I could see these stories as they were tied to Monticello. They were tied there through business, through purchase, but also through ties of kinship and bondage. The two men that I started with were David Isaacs and Uriah Levy, but their stories brought me to many more people along the way, so you'll hear a lot of their names today. Now, I did spend some time researching Jewish involvement in slavery in the South, as it's kind of an important starting point to answering this research question. What's important to understand about this is that Jews were coming from places where they were outsiders and significantly discriminated against in many of their home countries, especially in Europe. They were often the subjects of violence due to status as an other in their society. And over time, in the colonies of North and South America and in the Caribbean, the goal by Jewish colonists was to assimilate and to blend in. This led Jewish people in these colonies and eventually the United States operating quite similarly to their white non-Jewish counterparts. So that means that Jews did enslave people. They did buy and sell people, but they were not typically the largest slaveholders, nor were they historically planters or farmers, because in Europe they had been restricted to certain occupations, which led them to urban centers and jobs that were not primarily agricultural. And this continued after they immigrated. According to the 1820 federal census, the average Jewish household in the United States enslaved about 3 people, who were likely operating as domestic servants, someone working inside their home. When it came to the slave trade itself, there were also Jewish traders, but the sizes of these firms were negligible compared to those owned by non-Jewish people. Right? There was a Jewish family in the Petersburg and Richmond area called the Davises, and they were slave traders. You can see one of their advertisements actually up here. Hard to see because I had it on microfilm, so it also had the back of that newspaper in it as well. And it was taken out by Benjamin Davis in the Richmond City Directory, showing that the Jewish Davis family operated an auction and commission house, specializing in the sale of enslaved people. Now, on the other side of the argument, though, Jews were also abolitionists who spent their time working for anti-slavery causes and advocating for emancipation of enslaved people. So, like everybody else, some people were fighting for it, some people were fighting against it. Now, as we think about telling Jewish stories at Monticello, first you kind of come to the man himself, Thomas Jefferson. If people are thinking at all about Jefferson and Judaism, it's likely minimal on a normal basis, though I can confirm as a tour guide, I was asked about it more than once on a tour. So when you think about Jefferson and Judaism, I'm going to say that the first thing you think of probably isn't an article like this one. Right? An article for the New York Times in 2007 claimed that Jefferson could have had a way back Jewish ancestor based on some of his DNA. Now, arguing that that makes Jefferson our first Jewish president, I think is a bit of a stretch, to say the least. I think if you go far enough back, everybody's got the same ancestors anyway. More than likely, if you're thinking about Jefferson and Judaism, people are often thinking about this. Right. In 1777, Thomas Jefferson famously drafted the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. This is something he considered to be one of his greatest achievements. It's a document with a long-lasting legacy, including influencing the First Amendment and federal protection of freedom of religion in the United States. Jefferson was a proponent of the separation of church and state, and ultimately he believed that a person's religious belief was between that person and their own God, or between that person and nobody else at all. Right? This belief extended to people from religions all over the world. In his partially completed autobiography, Jefferson wrote that, quote, "Within the mantle of the statute's protection were the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination." So all these people and others could be protected in the United States and should be able to practice freely based on Jefferson's beliefs. Now, throughout his own lifetime, Thomas Jefferson also had a number of Jewish correspondents. Some of them he spoke to about Judaism itself. Some of them he spoke to about completely different topics. I'll highlight a few of these people throughout my talk, whose stories are part of this broader story of Monticello, but even more of them are listed here on this slide, right? David Salisbury Franks was a vice consul to Marseille when Jefferson was serving in France as ambassador. He is writing to people like Moses Myers, a prominent banker in Norfolk, Abraham Cohen, who wrote to him about the scientific benefits of mineral water, right? So things of various topics. Now, there were also others. The first person I will highlight for you is Mordecai Manuel Noah. Now, Noah was a journalist and a diplomat, and in 1813 he was appointed by James Madison as the consul to Tunis. He was then recalled by, before he was president, James Monroe. Monroe said, quote, "It was not known that the religion you profess would form any obstacle to the exercise of your consular functions." We don't know exactly what is going to cause Monroe to recall Noah, but clearly as part of this quote, he is stating that his Judaism has something to do with it. Okay. Now, Noah was also a cousin of Uriah Levy, which to me showed an interesting connection. We don't have any proof that Thomas Jefferson and Uriah Levy ever met or corresponded, but Jefferson is clearly writing to a member of Uriah Levy's extended family. And Noah then also later gave a speech at the reconsecration of the New York synagogue Shearith Israel, and that he sent his remarks to Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and James Madison. Jefferson sent Noah back a response. In writing back, Jefferson acknowledged what many knew to be true, that Jews had been systematically persecuted throughout history because of their religious affiliations. He hoped that the laws of the United States would help to alleviate that persecution, but then he secondly acknowledged that there was more to be done because public opinion did not always match the laws that were in place at the time. Now, I took this. He was a doctor from Charleston, and Jefferson was writing saying that he hoped Jews would be able to, quote, "take their seats on the benches of science as preparatory to their doing the same at the board of government." Now, it would be another 25 years after Jefferson wrote this letter that any Jewish person would be elected to Congress or the Senate. One of De La Mata's contemporaries in Charleston was a man named Isaac Harvey. And Harvey came from a slaveholding family in Charleston, and estimates from that time say that about of the 109 Jewish households in Charleston, about 92 of them enslaved people, so a vast majority. According to the 1810 census, Harvey himself enslaved 7 people. He was a journalist, but he's actually mostly known as being an early advocate of reforming the Jewish laws and principles, leading to the later Reform movement. In 1827, Harvey served as the president of an organization that was dedicated to this idea. I will read it for you because I think that the name is funny. The Reformed Society of Israelites promoting true principles of Judaism according to its purity and spirit. And I can't imagine that he wrote that out on everything that he ever had to write to someone, but it had quite the long name. Eventually, I think it gets a little bit condensed later on, you know. But before serving in that leadership role for that organization, he did write to Jefferson about these proposed reforms that he was advocating on behalf of. Jefferson told Harvey that he thought reforms to everything were necessary as the human mind expanded and improved. He also spoke briefly about the University of Virginia, saying that imposed theological reading would not be compulsory to the curriculum. Now, one thing I liked about the letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote back to Harvey was that he says, quote, I am little acquainted with the liturgy of their Jews or their mode of worship. And this is something that becomes clear in some of Jefferson's writings, is that he knows that he's trying to understand a religion he doesn't quite understand. And he knows that his understanding is rudimentary, so he is trying to learn more about that in kind of classic Thomas Jefferson fashion. Now, while he was corresponding with Jewish people from around the country, he was also talking to people from Virginia. He's writing letters, he's doing business with Jews in Virginia, and one of the most affluent Jews in Richmond was a man named Joseph Marks. He was eventually the director of the Richmond branch of the Second Bank of the United States, and he wrote a series of letters back and forth to Jefferson for between 1817 and 1820. Marks wrote to Jefferson about what was called the Sanhedrin in Paris. This was essentially a Jewish governing board that was established by Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, it had been created in 1806, but the laws in France kind of went back and forth. So first, they were restrictive against Jewish people. Then Napoleon abolished those laws, and then he went back and reinstituted the first laws. Marx sent some of this information to Jefferson about the Sanhedrin, and Jefferson responded to him. You can see an image of Marx, and these are some of the letters that they sent back, but I'll read you one of the quotes. Jefferson said that he regretted, quote, seeing a sect the parent and basis of all those of Christendom, singled out by all of them for persecution and oppression, which prove they have profited nothing from the benevolent doctrines of him whom they profess to make the model of their principles and practice. Now, while there were a number of Jewish contemporaries Jefferson's writing to, tried to focus a little more closely on Charlottesville and the people that he is talking to here in this community. Now, there weren't many, but Jefferson's memorandum books indicated that he was at the very least doing business with Jewish men like Isaac Raphael, Joel Wolfe, and David Isaacs. Now, Raphael and Isaacs were both merchants who owned dry goods stores. Joel Wolfe was Raphael's brother-in-law, and they owned the store together. They worked in business together. And then they had another brother-in-law, Nathaniel Wolfe, who was a lawyer in town. Now, from the business of Wolfe and Raphael, Jefferson bought things like cheese and tea and sugar, but he also wrote a letter that he said that Raphael, quote, holds my little bank here. And it seems by looking at these records that Jefferson was holding credit lines with these men, right? He's holding credit lines, borrowing small sums of money from them, and then he is paying off other credits using that money and owing those credit lines back. From David Isaacs, Jefferson bought a number of things, including foodstuffs, again, like cheese and beef, but also a horse named Tecumseh, and a ball of twine that was eventually the ball of twine that was used to map out the very first pavilion of UVA's academical village. It came from the store of David Isaacs. Now, Isaacs also sent Jefferson a copy of a pamphlet about Judaism called Elements of the Jewish Faith. Jefferson read, he thanked Isaacs for in a later letter. Now, in late June 1826, just before Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, he recorded his very last entry in his memorandum books, and it was for a purchase of cheese from the store of David Isaacs. We'll get much more into Isaacs' story because he is one of the main people that I focused on in my research. Now, in 1822, 1823, Jefferson is borrowing regularly from people like Isaac Raphael, and he said, he's the one who held his bank. Now, you can see just based on what I've even highlighted here how often that is happening in Jefferson's memorandum book. He said he's drawing on or giving order on Raphael for money or for credit. Now, in trying to find these ties between Charlottesville's Jewish community and slavery, which was part of what I was looking at, I learned a lot from simple census data. According to the 1820 federal census, Isaac Raphael enslaved 3 people. All 3 were women, 1 under the age of 14, and 2 others that fell in the age range of 26 to 44. And backing up this kind of previous idea that most Jewish enslavers owned a small number of people that were likely working in homes and stores or in some kind of domestic capacity. It's also possible that one of the women in that 26 to 44 age range had a daughter who could have been the one who was under 14, but I only have numbers, right? And I don't necessarily have their names. Now, Other Charlottesville Jews were similar. I looked up some other people to see these examples and if they all fell under the same kind of pattern. Jacob Bachrach, who was from a bit of a later time period, he was a Jewish merchant, and in 1860, in the census, he was recorded as enslaving 2 women in his household. Nathaniel Wolfe, the brother-in-law of Raphael, he and the Raphaels moved to Louisville, and there they enslaved 3 people. He also had 2 women and 1 man working in his home, as well as an Irish domestic servant that was recorded in that census as well. So these patterns did continue through the research that I was doing. And that brings me really to the Isaacs family, David Isaacs being one of the main people that I was looking into. Just a quick, show of hands, I guess, to the folks in this room. Has anyone heard the names David Isaacs or Nancy West before today? A few of you, maybe. That's okay. If not, you'll learn about them now. That's the point, right? Now, I learned about the Isaacs West family before I started doing this research, and that was part of what brought me to it because I found their story to be extremely interesting and compelling what it provided. And David Isaacs was a German Jewish immigrant who made his way to Charlottesville by 1793. He followed his older brother Isaiah, who was the one who had moved to Richmond. Now, he was named one of the executors of the will of Thomas West, and through that, he met West's daughter, Nancy. Now, Nancy West, who's sometimes referred to as Anne in various documents, she was born to a white father, Thomas West, and a formerly enslaved woman named Priscilla. So Nancy West was of mixed racial background. Now, she was born a free woman of color and lived most of her life in a common law marriage, essentially, to David Isaacs. They had 7 children together, but they were never able to legally marry due to the laws prohibiting interracial marriage in Virginia. Now, doubly, they were also not married under the eyes of the Jewish faith because Nancy West was not Jewish, so they wouldn't have been able to be married in the eyes of a synagogue or a local community either. And they spent their years in and out of court defending their relationship. If you want to learn more about some of the specifics, there is a wonderful book by Joshua Rothman called Notorious in the Neighborhood, and he focused a lot on this story of what they were doing in court and goes through all the court records, and I used a lot of that research to help build up some of this as well. Isaacs and West are among only 5 known instances in Virginia in which the documentary evidence indicates the cohabitation of a Jewish person and a free black person. They were also the only of those 5 who were ever brought to court over it. Now, shown here is actually on the side part of David Isaacs' will. It's housed here at the Charlottesville courthouse. He willed various lots of his land that he owned, his furniture, and his home to Nancy West, and he formally acknowledged her in his will as the mother of their 7 children. He gave money to a woman named Penelope, Penelope's son, and someone he said in his will as Old Siller, who I believe was Nancy West's mother, Priscilla. Now, one quick note, just because it's easier, I will refer to them as husband and wife, even though they were not legally married, because they lived that way for so many years and they thought of each other in that manner. Now, in 1837, the same year that her husband died, Nancy West was required to file for a deed of manumission. And that's what this image is here. And it was partially, even though she was born free, she never had those legal papers that declared her as free. And so she was 56 years old, having to prove it due to the more restrictive laws that were becoming prevalent in Virginia. Note, too, that on her manumission papers, her name is Nancy Isaacs. Right? So indicating, too, that relationship between David Isaacs and Nancy West. In her own right, Nancy West was kind of a force to be reckoned with. She owned significant property, and she was the wealthiest non-white person in Charlottesville. She had approximately $6,000 in estimated property value in like the 1820s. It's a lot, right? She signed her will and her other documents with her mark, which indicates to me that it's quite likely that Nancy West was not literate and still accomplished all of these things. She was a baker. She had her own shop. And owned multiple lots on Main Street in Charlottesville, separate from the lots that were later deeded to her by David Isaacs in his will. In 1850, the year she eventually left Charlottesville, an article in the Stanton Republican Vindicator wrote about free people of color being forced to leave the state because of the laws. The article said of Nancy West, quote, "This old woman is in her 70th year and is the owner of some of the most valuable property in this town. She was born and raised here, and with the exception of the time she was out of the Commonwealth, a little upwards of a year, has always resided in Charlottesville. It may seem hard to enforce the law in her case, but as there are others who are not as wealthy against whom the law will be enforced, it is probable that she cannot escape its penalty." She had 7 children with David Isaacs, as I mentioned, 3 daughters and 4 sons, all of whom went by the last name Isaacs. Jane, Thomas, Hayes, Tucker, Frederick, Julia Ann, and Agnes. The Isaacs West family is not only tied to Monticello through the business that David Isaacs is conducting with Thomas Jefferson, but also through the enslaved community at Monticello. 2 of the children of David Isaacs and Nancy West married into Monticello's Hemingses family. And Tucker Isaacs married a woman named Anne Elizabeth Fossetts. She was the daughter of Joseph and Edith Fossetts and a great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Hemingses. And Julia Ann Isaacs married Eston Hemingses, the son of Thomas Jefferson and the enslaved woman Sally Hemingses. So following Thomas Jefferson's death, Joseph Fossetts, who was Anne Elizabeth's father, and Eston Hemingses both received their freedom. They lived in Charlottesville in close proximity to members of the Isaacs and West family. Now, this is a map, a historic map, of what we now think of as the downtown mall of Charlottesville, right? It's essentially what we know as that kind of downtown area, and looking simply at how many lots were owned by members of these families, it's clear that they had significant property, right? E.H. being Eston Hemingses, David Isaacs, Hayes Isaacs, and Nancy West, and Joseph Fossetts as well. So all these families tied together. At various times, Eston Hemingses is owning multiple lots, including parts of Lot 35, which I found records of at the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society. So I'll get to that in a moment. Now, what I'm going to do really quickly is show you what these lots are today, right? These are the same lots on the places we go regularly in Charlottesville. So restaurants like the Melting Pot, Citizen Burger, Bizou, Jack Brown's, they were on land that were owned by members of the Isaacs, West, Fossetts, and Hemingses families. Banks and pharmacies, concert venues, toy stores, bookshops. Right? All these spots are on places that were owned at times by members of the Isaacs, West, Fossetts, and Hemingses families. Now, that one lot in particular was quite interesting, Lot 35. I found records of this at the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, and there are resources everywhere, right? I didn't do just my research at Monticello, at other places as well. Now, Nancy West owned Lot 35. In 1844, she sold that lot to Eston Hemingses. He was her son-in-law at that point. Hemingses no longer lived in Charlottesville, as he and his wife had already moved to a place called Chillicothe, Ohio. He apparently still owned property in the city, though. 1 year later, he sold part of that land to his brother-in-law, Tucker Isaacs, son of Nancy West. And then Tucker and Isaacs and his wife, Anne Elizabeth Fossetts, will also briefly go to Ohio. And they were back in Charlottesville at that point to visit Nancy West, Tucker's mother, who was still here. In 1849, Eston Hemingses sold the remainder of the lot back to Nancy West, relinquishing possibly his only remaining tie to the city. In 1850, Nancy West sold her portion to her son, and then the same year they sold the whole thing to someone not related to them, right, to a firm called Hood in Laban. Now, it's in that year 1850 specifically that Nancy West, Tucker Isaacs, and Anne Elizabeth Fossetts Isaacs all finally leave Charlottesville for good and move to Chillicothe, Ohio. But one thing Nancy West did consistently was pass property back and forth among members of her family, possibly in an attempt to grow a generational wealth that they could then continue to prosper from over time and after her lifetime as well. Eventually, when she died in 1856, she left an extensive will denoting certain things to her children, but then also to her grandchildren, leaving stocks, bonds, things like that. A lot of wealth and property in her will, but again, signed with her mark. The most valuable property, that's me. All good. Now, the second youngest child of David Isaacs and Nancy West was a daughter named Julia Ann Isaacs. She was born in 1814 in Charlottesville, and in 1832 she married Eston Hemings. At that point, he was then free. He was the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Eston Hemings was freed in his father's will when he turned 21 years old, which would have been in 1829, but it seems that he was living free earlier than that, even if it was not when his legal freedom began. Jefferson, in his will, requested specific permission for the 5 men that he freed so that they would be allowed to stay in the state of Virginia and would be exempt from the removal law of 1806 that forced people to leave within 1 year of receiving freedom. Now, sometime in the few years following the death of Eston's mother, Sally Hemings, in 1835, this section of the Hemings family moved to Chillicothe, Ohio, with 2 small children in tow, a son named John Wales and a daughter named Anna. Now, other members of Monticello's enslaved community who were living in freedom went to Chillicothe as well, including Eston's brother Madison Hemings and other members of the Fossetts family that I mentioned. After living in Chillicothe for over 10 years, Eston and Julia Ann Hemings moved with their 3 children at that point to Madison, Wisconsin. It's at that point that they changed their last name to Jefferson and assumed identities within the white community. Eston Hemings came from 3 generations of mixed-race parentage. Julia Ann Isaacs came from 2 generations of the same, so they were perceived as white people when they joined the white community. So I continued to ask myself this throughout the project: what does this tell me about Jewish people in this time? We know that Julia Ann Isaacs would not have been accepted as Jewish by the Jewish community in Richmond because her mother was not Jewish. That's where her father belonged to the synagogue, though. We also have no records that indicate that any of David Isaacs' children ever considered themselves Jewish or that they ever practiced the Jewish faith. But that doesn't mean that they weren't aware of the practices and aware of the beliefs. When David Isaacs died, the first part of his will stated that he wanted to be buried in the Richmond Hebrew Cemetery in Chapel Hill. That was the cemetery for the synagogue in Richmond. It was also on land that his brother Isaiah donated to that synagogue. Now, I did find this, though, to be a bit of a curious choice on the part of David Isaacs. He died before the other members of his family, but by making that choice, he is knowing actively that his wife, who is not considered Jewish, and his children, who are not considered Jewish, would not have been able to be buried next to or near him in that temple, or in that cemetery. It was actually David Isaacs' son Tucker and his son-in-law Eston Hemings who accompanied his body after he passed away to Richmond in 1837. Eston Hemings would have then witnessed a Jewish burial ceremony. He likely heard Hebrew prayers and perhaps saw a worship ceremony at the same time. Now, all this being said, it's noted later by a number of sources, including the obituaries of, at that point, her name, Julia Ann Isaacs Hemings Jefferson, that said she was involved in the Congregational Church in Madison, Wisconsin. So clearly, in some way at that point, right, she's practicing also a Christian religious practice too. Now, the other direct Monticello connection through this family is through David Isaacs and Nancy West's son, Tucker. Though their marriage wasn't officially recorded until later in 1848, Tucker Isaacs married Anne Elizabeth Fossetts. They were living married earlier than that because they had their first child in 1832. At that time, Anne Elizabeth Fossetts was still technically living enslaved. She had never legally been freed, and her children with Tucker Isaacs would have also then been born enslaved because their mother was legally enslaved at that time. At the dispersal sale that was held at Monticello in 1827, following Thomas Jefferson's death, Anne Elizabeth Fossetts was sold for $450 to a man named John Wynne, who most likely bought her at the request of her father, Joseph Fossetts, because not long after Wynne purchased Anne Elizabeth, he sold her back to her father. But because of the removal law in Virginia at that time, Joseph Fossetts had to continue to hold his family legally, technically, in bondage, otherwise they would have been forced to leave without being able to get more members of their family with them. On September 15th, 1837, Joseph Fossetts went to the courthouse. He manumitted his wife, Edith Hearn Fossetts, his sons, William, Daniel, and Jesse, his daughters, Anne Elizabeth and Lucy, and 4 of Anne Elizabeth and Tucker Isaacs' children. Now, they were named James, Joseph, Thomas, and Maria Elizabeth. Originally, the Isaacs moved with the Fossetts to Ohio, but then they came back to Charlottesville because Tucker's mother, Nancy, was still living here. They remained here until 1850 when they finally moved back to Ohio, bringing Nancy West with them. The Isaacs home, which is what you see here, in Springfield Township outside Chillicothe, was a noted site on the Underground Railroad. The light that hung from the porch was said to be a beacon to refugee slaves who were hoping to escape the cruelties of slavery in the South. These are actually sketches of what that home looked like. It is no longer extant. It is not standing. Similarly to his sister Julia Ann, it's unlikely that Tucker Isaacs had any major connections to a Jewish heritage. He accompanied his father's body to that burial in Richmond, along with his brother-in-law, Eston Hemings, but there's no evidence to say that he felt any connection to Judaism. Instead, clearly, Tucker Isaacs and his wife felt deeply connected to the free black communities that they were living in and were trying to help those who were formerly enslaved or trying to seek freedom. As I considered the Isaacs and West families, I started to look at what David Isaacs' Jewish contemporaries were doing and how that could inform me about perhaps his choices to live in this kind of common law marriage to a free black woman. Now, clearly, as I've shown already, some of those contemporaries, like Isaac Raphael, Nathaniel Wolfe, they were enslaving a few domestic laborers. They had people that they owned that were living in their homes. But David Isaacs' closest contemporary was actually his brother Isaiah. Now, Isaiah Isaacs became one of the more interesting kind of offshoots. Didn't really mean to find Isaiah Isaacs, I just did. He was born in Germany like his brother. He was older than David Isaacs, and he came to Richmond as early as 1769. He helped found that synagogue, and he donated the land that became the cemetery where David Isaacs would eventually be buried. Now, Isaiah came to Charlottesville about 1 year before his brother, so around 1792. Don't know exactly what his job was here, but he did operate one of those kind of merchant-like stores in Richmond, so it's quite possible he was doing the same thing here. So when I first questioned what made David Isaacs different, rather than enslaving people like his Jewish contemporaries, he married a free woman of color, had children who were of mixed racial background. I wondered if it had anything to do with where he was born, coming from Germany. But then I found that his brother, also born in Germany, mimicked more so what the others around him were doing. Isaiah Isaacs enslaved at least 5 people in Virginia. Now, one thing I'll note before I change the slide is you can see kind of faintly over here to the right, this is a partial image of Isaiah Isaacs' will. And over there, next to where Isaiah Isaacs signed, it's that he signed his name in Hebrew script. Right, so you can see that there as well. Now, yeah, just kind of the bottom third there. So the records do indicate that Isaiah Isaacs enslaved a woman named Lucy, who he actually manumitted in 1799. Her manumission, though, was recorded in the Richmond courts. So it's possible that she was either living in Richmond, maybe he still had property in Richmond that she was living on or running or working at, but it's hard to kind of track her after that, so I'm not quite sure what happened to her. In 1803, when Isaiah Isaacs filed his will in Albemarle County, it was indicated 4 other people because he manumits them in his will, though he manumits them with restrictions. So this shows that Isaiah Isaacs enslaved at least 2 other women and 2 men. He names people Rachel, Polly, Henry, and James. Now, some who have done research over time on the Jews of Charlottesville often point to Isaiah Isaacs as someone who perhaps realized the wrongs of slavery. The reason for that being in his will, he says, being of the opinion that all men are by nature equally free, and being possessed of some of those beings who are unfortunately doomed to slavery as to them, I must enjoin upon my executor a strict observance of the following clause of my will. That clause is that he then goes on to free those 4 people, Rachel, James, Polly, and Henry, in that order. On the surface, this could be seen as kind of his realization that enslavement was wrong. He is not freeing any of these people immediately upon his death. Right? I don't know the birth dates of all of the people that he is freeing, so it's hard to tell if maybe it's a specific age that he is indicating that year, so it's like when they turn a certain age, that's the year that they might be freed. But later he puts a specific age of 31 for when his female slaves might be freed, so I think it could possibly translate to something like that. Now, he's also, at the same time, not freeing them immediately and continuing their enslavement, and for women especially, the possible enslavement of any children that they might have before that year that they become freed. And so taking the other examples of others who freed enslaved people in their wills, like Thomas Jefferson, right? It's not always an indicator that it is absolving them of the wrongs of slavery in the first place. Now, a later codicil to Isaiah Isaacs' will was in January 1806. He indicates 2 or 3 children that were born to the enslaved woman Rachel by that point. It's unclear if it's Mary, Clement, and Washington, or Mary and a boy named Clement Washington. Old records are hard sometimes. And this is where I came to a few roadblocks, because I was trying to see what happened to these people after this. I was successful in part because of the 4 people, Rachel, Polly, Henry, and James, I found Rachel and Polly in later records. They were in federal censuses listed as Rachel Isaacs and Polly Isaacs. I couldn't, however, ever locate Henry or James. But when looking through manumission deeds, registrations of free black people later on, I found 2 men, John Garner and Nicholas Wynn, who both had papers saying that they were freed per the last will and testament of Isaiah Isaacs. I wasn't quite sure who they were, where they came from, if they translated to any of the people that I had already tried to research, but they were filed in Albemarle County, so it's quite possible. Spent time at the courthouse, rifled through documents, lots of things like that. And then I saw something I noticed. I had a typed copy of references to free black people in Albemarle County. And there was one reference that had the name Henry with a strike through. And then it said John T. Garner. And so I think this could indicate that the person who was at one point enslaved under Isaiah Isaacs, named Henry, maybe in freedom changed his name. And maybe eventually became that person, John Garner, who had manumission papers that said he was freed in the will of Isaiah Isaacs. While historical mysteries are fun, I had 30 days to conduct this research, and I did have to stop myself because I said, this is not your point, but maybe come back to it later on, right? Now, I was interested, though, in Rachel Isaacs and who she was. She was the one person in Isaiah Isaacs' will that I could continue to find reference to. She was listed in the 1833 Albemarle County Free Negro Register, which required all free black people in the county to register where they lived, as well as then the federal censuses from 1820 all the way through 1860. She lived to be at least 77 years old and was recorded as a washwoman in the 1860 census. So to me, this tells me some things. It tells us that some of the story of a woman who was formerly enslaved in Charlottesville and was able to then gain her freedom in some capacity, right? It tells us how there was also a Jewish man from Germany who enslaved this woman. And it shows me that we still always need additional information, that you never actually find all the things that you want. Because until I did all of those extra steps, if I had just looked at the written record and what it told me, I would have seen a person named Rachel Isaacs. And I would have very much assumed that that person was a Jewish person living in Charlottesville, and not a formerly enslaved woman owned by a Jewish man in the city. So I kept going with all these stories. Now at this point, I will transition to the other person I was looking at, which of course, when you're thinking about Monticello, thinking about Jewish history, the Levy family cannot be separated from the Jewish history of Monticello, as they were absolutely instrumental in the way that Monticello continued. Right? But it's often what most people would think about if they are thinking about Jewish history tied to this site. Now, multiple members of the Levy family were subject to anti-Semitic attacks based on their attacks on their Americanness, their ability to care for this site of American history when Uriah Levy came into ownership of the site. They were called foreigners and aliens just because they were Jewish, not because of anything else. Uriah Levy was a 5th-generation person born in North America, or eventually the United States. But today I'm going to focus a little primarily on those ties to enslavement, because Uriah Levy, and I'll talk a little bit about his brother Jonas Levy, their stories also intersected with these stories of slavery at Monticello, but just after the life of Thomas Jefferson. Now, on his mother's side, like I said, Uriah Levy was 5th-generation American. His mother's side, the Mikado line, had been in the United States since a man named Samuel Nunez came with 40 other Jews to help found the colony of Georgia in Savannah in 1733. Rebecca Machado, or Mikado, that's her picture right up there on the top right, married a man named Jonas Phillips, whose photo is right below her. They had 21 children, which is why this family is absolutely giant. important. So there are a lot of members of the Levy family extended. And the Levy side of the family, right, Uriah Levy's father's side is a little less known. His mother's side, a prominent Jewish family of Portuguese and Sephardic descent. His father's side, less well known, of German and Ashkenazi descent. Now, though Uriah Levy was born in Philadelphia, his family belonged to the first synagogue established in New York called She'arat Yisrael. Uriah Levy's parents, Rachel Phillips and Michael Levy, were married in Philadelphia in 1787, and I found an unexpected connection to Thomas Jefferson here when I didn't think I would find one. Attending the wedding of Uriah Levy's parents was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Dr. Benjamin Rush, Philadelphia. He wrote about the ceremony in a letter to his wife, which some believe might be the first kind of description of a Jewish wedding in the Americas. And it's actually kind of a comical letter to me because he writes about the strange customs that he had never seen before. He writes about hearing the Hebrew language, and he said he could only understand an amen or a hallelujah. He noticed other parts of the ceremony that have been part of Jewish heritage for a long time and continue to be. He talked about the couple standing under a canopy, which was a chuppah, and he wrote about the ceremonial breaking of the glass. He wrote about men having their heads covered. And he told his wife that afterward he went up to the people who attended the ceremony and he asked them about their customs so that he could understand them a bit better. Rachel Phillips Levy, whose image you see here, was also said to love Monticello. Right, her son Uriah purchased the property in 1834, and then starting in 1836, she took up residence there. 3 years later, in 1839, Rachel Phillips Levy passed away while at Monticello, and because Jewish custom dictated she needed to be buried within 24 hours. The family chose to bury her on the mountaintop at Monticello, and still to this day, you can go visit Rachel Phillips Levy's grave at the Monticello home. It sits on Mulberry Row in the site of an old stone house that in Jefferson's time quite possibly was a wash house. It was at the center of where the enslaved community lived and worked on the mountaintop. Now, oftentimes when we talk about the Levys, we talk about how Uriah Levy admired Thomas Jefferson, his views on religious freedom, his authorship of that statute for religious freedom. Glossed over often, though, is the fact that Uriah Levy, during his ownership of Monticello, also enslaved people on that mountaintop. At various times, various numbers, but approximately could be up to 21 people. So I wanted to look more into this, bringing me back to that kind of research question of a man from New York, Uriah Levy, enslaving people in Charlottesville, while a man from Virginia, David Isaacs, is instead ingraining himself into that black community as well. Now, I wouldn't necessarily characterize Uriah Levy as someone who was pro-slavery, but he's not advocating for it in any public manner. But I will say that he was, like many others, he was participating in it. He was profiting from the institution of slavery himself, or itself. He didn't enslave people in New York, which was where his primary residence was, because it was illegal there. But he could enslave people in Virginia, and he did. Now, local historian, one of my fellow board members, Sam Towler, has done significant research to track down some of the people enslaved, not only by Uriah Levy, but also by farm managers during this period, like Ira Garrison and Joel Wheeler. Levy had approximately 20 enslaved people at Monticello. Wheeler eventually also had about 20 as well. So there could have been upwards of 40 or more enslaved people still operating on this land during the Levy period. Now, the main families that were there, enslaved families, were the Wests. So far, Sam and I have talked, we don't think they're connected, but we also don't know. They could be connected to the West of Nancy West's family, but it's kind of hard to tell, and we can't find, the records go dead, right? I will say, and I'll just give a plug, that on the YouTube page for the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, you can go back and watch the whole talk that Sam gave about this topic, I think back in 2019 maybe, but it's on YouTube. I watched it as part of my research, and now I'm here giving this talk. So I hope you'll go watch it too, because it was really an interesting talk, and I learned a lot from it, right? Now, the first recorded purchase of an enslaved person by Uriah Levy was a woman named Aggie Dickerson West. She was a cook, and he purchased her in 1835, just 1 year after his purchase of Monticello. Levy's listed on both the 1850 and 1860 Federal Census slave schedules, which is showing here. These little yellow sections are showing the people that Uriah Levy owned as slaves in that time based on this document, and it shows also their age ranges and things like that too. Now, The number changed and fluctuated. In 1864, the Confederacy confiscated the property, and at that point there were 19 enslaved people who were sold along with the house at Monticello. Right? There are references in other records to enslaved people at Monticello. As I mentioned, Levy employed people like Garrison and later Wheeler, who may have enslaved people on that land. They also may have overseen the labor of enslaved people or some combination of the two. Uriah Levy also had a late-in-life marriage to his niece, Virginia Lopez, who ended up living until 1925. She gave accounts of her time at Monticello and told a number of stories about the enslaved people. She mentioned a man or child named Juba, who there are no other records of, but could have been a name she used for someone else, possibly Joshua or John West, names that have popped up over time. And Jonas Phillips Levy, Uriah's brother, also later left an unpublished biography or autobiography. He spoke about his visit to Monticello in 1835, saying that Uriah Levy was, quote, superintending his slaves and other workmen on the property. So these references persist, noting that there were enslaved people there after the time of Jefferson and through into the Levy period. Now, another question I did find myself asking when I went back to Uriah Levy's history as a naval commander. While perhaps not immediately relevant to his ownership of Monticello, Uriah Levy spent much of his career in the United States Navy, and he's actually known as one of the strongest proponents against the use of flogging as punishment for sailors. He was so much against the practice that on a ship that he captained called the USS Macedonian, he outlawed the practice and he tried other punishments, including making sailors wear a sign around their neck dictating their crime, like drunkenness or thievery, so that they would be humiliated among everyone else. So taking all of this, what I was asking myself really was, how were enslaved people treated at Monticello under the ownership of Uriah Levy, under the ownership of a man who spent his entire career talking about how wrong it was to use the whip against sailors? All right. Now, Uriah Levy did publish an essay on the use of flogging in the Navy. It was 139 pages long. I will spare you most of that essay. But I will read you some of the quotes that he said, just because they are very relevant to this question I was asking myself. He said, quote, "The question may therefore soon become not whether the power to inflict corporal punishment shall be taken from the commanders of our ships of war, but what disciplinary means shall be submitted for that authority." He continued, "All admit that such commanders acting singly should be, on their people deck, superior to everybody and to everything, except the laws of God and of their country. Can such a supremacy be maintained without the means of checking the lazy and the skulking, the vicious and the unruly, by a system of terror?" Now, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to the question of how were people treated under the ownership of Uriah Levy. There don't seem to be any records at this point that I've found that talk about that specifically, but I was able to look a little bit more at their lives and what that might show me to give me a little bit of insight into this question. So I decided to only focus primarily on one of the people enslaved by Uriah Levy here, a woman and cook named Aggie Dickerson West. It's believed that she was married maybe to John West, that they had 5 children, all of whom were presumably then owned by Levy, because Aggie West was owned by Levy, so her children would be as well. There were 2 sons named Fleming and Joshua, 3 daughters named Daisy, Augusta, and Martha. It's possible that Aggie was short for Augusta, unclear. She's referred to often as the name Aggie by her enslavers. She was bought by Levy from the miner family of Carsbrook in 1835, and she lived until 1858. Ira Garrison, one of the farm managers, wrote a letter to Uriah Levy informing him in 1858 of Aggie West's death. And Levy subsequently wrote a letter later to his lawyer, George Carr, that Garrison, quote, "afflicts me with the announcement of the death of my faithful servant Aggie. I shall miss her very much, for she was much attached to me as I was to her." Levy's wife, Virginia, later spoke about Aggie in her recollection that she left as well, saying she was an excellent cook, but that she was unhappy when she was taken north and separated from her family. So this doesn't tell us how Aggie Dickerson West felt about it, because we don't have her words or her thoughts. But it does tell us how they viewed her. They favored her for her cooking skills. People like Uriah Levy felt that she was close to them or loyal, per se. She wanted to be among her family, however, and made it known when she was separated from them that she was unhappy about it, leading me to believe that perhaps she was not as attached to Uriah Levy as he thought she was. Now, Virginia Lopez Levy's account shares a few stories. I will say that those stories used antiquated and racist language in them. Right? She referred to the enslaved people as darkies, talked about things that they did and how she interacted with them. In telling her stories and in the publishing of these accounts, they were put into newspaper, she spoke of an unnamed enslaved child who she said she, quote, made somewhat of a pet of. Then she also spoke by name about Juba and Aggie. The words of Virginia Lopez Levy indicated to me that she was speaking of enslaved people in the same ways that her other white, non-Jewish counterparts were as well, right? She used this racist language to describe them, told stories that were designed to make them look funny and daft, and show how people how she thought they were, quote unquote, amusing. Right? That's the language that she was using. Uriah Levy died on March 22nd, 1862. The Civil War had already broken out, and Virginia had already seceded from the United States, joining the Confederate States of America. In his will, Levy left the home of Monticello, former President Thomas Jefferson's house, to the people of the United States, which caused significant strife for the family because Virginia was no longer part of the United States, right? Members for many years afterward are fighting over this will. He also left to his nephew, whose name was written in the will as Ashel, but it's Asahel or Asahel. Things were always spelled wrong, often in records. He left him the land that he bought near Monticello called Washington Farm and, quote, all my Negro slaves, listed in the same sentence as the rest of his farm property, like horses, cattle, stocks, and crops. This bequest to Asahel Levy never occurred because the property was instead confiscated in 1864 by the Confederacy. It was confiscated as property belonging to supporters of the United States. So though Levy had already died, his will was not honored because of his ties to New York and the quote-unquote North. On November 17th, 1864, the Confederate government confiscated Monticello and held a sale of the property there. While the actual records are no longer extant because they burned in the city of Richmond, there are articles, like the one that you see here, from the New York Times. They called out the names of people who were sold at that confiscation sale. Some of those names match the names we already knew, and some don't. And then you wonder, is that someone that you thought you knew about, or is it someone completely new? So people who were called out, a man named Fuke, F-U-K-E maybe, who sold for $7,000. A man named Fleming, who's likely Fleming West, the son of Aggie West, who sold for $7,450. A man named Lewis, who sold for $7,350. A man named John, maybe John West, who sold to Uriah Levy's brother, Jonas Levy, for $5,400. Then a woman and her 7 children, who could be another woman named Ann Carey, who sold to a man named Benjamin Franklin Ficklin, who also owned Monticello for a short time. 5 total other young girls, and then a man and wife who were put up and withdrawn, bringing the number of people that are listed to about 19. So the thing that really struck me about this was that John, perhaps the enslaved man John West and the husband of Aggie West, was purchased by Uriah Levy's brother. Now, Jonas Levy, whose photos I really enjoy, was a captain of the American Merchant Marine, and he spent his life on the water just like his brother. He himself has a fascinating story. I don't have time for it, but it ended with him getting honorary citizenship to Peru, and coming back to Washington, D.C., where he petitioned for monetary compensation from losses from the Mexican-American War. Now, while he was living in Washington, he was involved in the Jewish community. He helped to found the Washington Hebrew Congregation, and he spent time petitioning for this money to be given back to him from the government, where he met prominent representatives like Jefferson Davis and a man named Judah Philip Benjamin, who was the first Jewish senator in the United States, and later served as Secretary of War for the Confederacy under Jefferson Davis. Now, Jonas Levy befriended these 2 men, later wrote many letters to them during the Civil War, In 1861, while his brother Uriah was in New York and only a year from death, Jonas Levy was residing at Monticello. He got into disputes with Monticello's farm manager, Joel Wheeler. Jonas Levy, a Southern apologist and supporter of the Confederacy, erected a Confederate flag. Joel Wheeler, who did not share the same sympathies, took the flag down. Wheeler and Levy got into a massive disagreement over this fact, and eventually Jonas Levy wrote to Judah Benjamin asking the Confederate government to send someone to Monticello to arrest Wheeler for taking down the flag. As far as I know, that never actually happened. Not sure. But after the death of his brother Uriah, Jonas Levy actually tried to prove his right to ownership of the Monticello home. In an 1862 letter to Senator B. Hill, Levy wrote, quote, "I am a loyal citizen of this Confederacy and have donated all my energies to the success of its cause." He, at the time, was a full-time resident of Wilmington, North Carolina, where he operated a store that supplied goods to the Confederate Army. He thought that Monticello should be rightfully his. Clearly, the petition was not considered because the house was then up for sale to anyone who wanted to purchase it by 1864. Jonas Levy was not the man who bought it that day. He did, however, buy an enslaved man at that same auction. Now, ultimately, people like Uriah Levy continue to prove what historians have argued, that Jewish people owned and treated enslaved people in the same way as their non-Jewish counterparts. I argue that it wasn't because of their Judaism that they owned slaves, but despite their Judaism. Right? They participated in their communities, Jewish communities, Southern communities, white communities, as individuals, and they made their decisions based on that. Members of the Levy family held pro-Southern sentiments, like Jonas Levy, just as members of the family offered to fight for Lincoln, like Uriah Levy did. Now, the Jewish stories that one can tell about Monticello enrich the history that is already there. They show the complicated ways that race and religion operate together. They show that people made decisions that favored one identity often over another. And they show that Jefferson's overall vision for a religiously free country allowed his contemporaries and later generations of Jewish people to continue being tied to his home and plantation. Looking at Monticello's history through the lens of Jewish people like David Isaacs and Uriah Levy only broadens our understanding of this site's complexities. It's the way these stories are told that's important. When I was a guide, I was asked time and again questions like, how did Uriah Levy make his money? And wow, he bought it for a lot less than he sold it for. Where'd that profit go? Right? The way we think about Jews is often steeped in thousands of years of history, which also means thousands of years of anti-Semitism. There are nuances to the stories of Jewish people at Monticello, and the language that is used to discuss this history lends itself to an understanding of their faith as Jewish people, but also to the place that they held in their societies and the way that they were treated by their contemporaries. August 12th was only 3 days ago. Back in 2017, 3 months before neo-Nazis marched swastikas down Charlottesville's Main Street, members of She'aret Yisrael congregation in New York, the congregation that Uriah Levy and his family belonged to, came to honor the anniversary of Rachel Phillips Levy's death. Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveitchik said, quote, "We seek to do good because we are inspired by the lives that have come before us. May they live on in the heart and memory of our American Jews for generations to come. I think they should also live on in the stories that are told in our local communities." So I want to thank you all so very much for your time and for listening today.
Because of the technical difficulties, we've gone a little bit over, but if anyone has any questions, feel free. And
where is Uriah Levy buried?
He is buried in New York, I believe, at the Congregation Cemetery.
And
Yeah.
his brother Jonas?
Oh, that I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I'm not sure where Jonas Levy ended up dying and where he was buried. I'd have to find out. Thank you.
The Isaacs family shunned David Isaacs for marrying Nancy West?
So,
or did they continue to have nice relationships? Or what?
Yeah, good question. As far as I know, the only other member of his family, like the Isaacs family, that I know about is his brother. And there wasn't any indication that he had some kind of falling out with his brother Isaiah, that they stopped talking, that they stopped, being around each other. But his brother was also older and died many years before David Isaacs died. So, but there wasn't any indication that caused any strife among them, right? And there's also, we can see from the censuses that, Isaiah Isaacs enslaved people, he freed them in his will. We also don't always know what those numbers mean, right? When you look at people like the Fossetts family, if you look at just the census, it says Joseph Fossetts enslaved 9 people. All 9 of those people were members of his own family that he was only enslaving because he wanted to free them all at the same time. So the numbers can sometimes be misleading in that way of understanding what do they mean just by looking at what is written in a census or something like that.
I just want to commend you publicly on how fantastic the research, and I can't imagine the amount of time that you put. I don't know how you find the time to do and all the minutiae and everything. If I ever want to know about my family, please give me your phone number.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can find out what the heck.
I'm also the keeper of my own family's family tree, and I've got boxes worth of photos at my house that need someone to go through them. So
I appreciate it. I'm sure everybody else does.
Thank you so much.
What a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming out tonight. If you all have any more questions, feel free to mingle with our speaker. Really appreciate seeing a nice crowd like this. If you are not a member and maybe we've touched her a little bit, come talk to Kay. She's got some information. We have some flyers and brochures there. Hope you can come to our exhibit starting in September. And other than that, have a fabulous evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
I know. There's so much I didn't even talk about. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I saw Shauna too. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Did I say anything wrong?